The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Robert Martinez adjusted his dress blues one final time. At 72 years old, his hands still moved with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years in the Army. The fabric felt familiar against his weathered skin, though the uniform hung a bit looser than it had during his active duty days. Today marked a solemn occasion that would bring together veterans from across 3 counties to honor their fallen brother, Staff Sergeant William Chun. Robert had known Billy Chun for only a few months before the young soldier's convoy hit an improvised explosive device outside Kandahar. The memory still burned fresh in Robert's mind, even 15 years after his own retirement. Billy had been just 24, full of dreams about opening a motorcycle repair shop when he returned home. Instead, he came back in a flag-draped coffin, leaving behind a young wife and twin daughters who would never remember their father's laugh. The funeral procession was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock sharp, starting from Morrison Funeral Home and ending at Riverside National Cemetery. Robert had volunteered to help organize the motorcycle escort, a tradition that had grown among veterans who wanted to ensure their brothers and sisters received the honor they deserved. 47 motorcycles would participate, their riders ranging from Vietnam veterans like himself to younger men and women who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. As Robert fired up his 1998 Harley-Davidson Road King, the familiar rumble brought a sense of calm to his nervous energy. The motorcycle had been his retirement gift to himself, purchased with money he had saved during his final deployment. Its chrome gleamed in the morning light, and small American flags fluttered from poles mounted behind the seat. A black ribbon tied around his left arm marked the somber nature of the day's mission. The gathering point buzzed with quiet activity as veterans arrived one by one. Some wore full-dress uniforms like Robert, while others had managed to find pieces of their old military attire. A few wore leather vests adorned with patches that told stories of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Despite the differences in their clothing, they all shared the same reverence for the task ahead. Margaret Chun, Billy's widow, stood near the funeral home entrance wearing a simple black dress. Her daughters, now teenagers, flanked her on either side. Robert had met Margaret twice before during planning meetings, and each time he was struck by her quiet strength. She had specifically requested the motorcycle escort, remembering how much her husband had loved riding before he enlisted. Officer Daniel Hayes of the Millbrook Police Department pulled his patrol car into the funeral home parking lot at 9:30. He was young, probably no more than 25, with closely cropped blonde hair and a by-the-book demeanor that Robert recognized from his own early military days. The officer stepped out of his vehicle and began examining the assembled motorcycles with obvious scrutiny. Robert watched as Officer Hayes approached the group, clipboard in hand. The young man's uniform was crisp and immaculate, his badge polished to a mirror shine. Everything about his appearance suggested someone who took regulations very seriously, perhaps too seriously for a day like today. "Excuse me," Officer Hayes called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "I need to speak with whoever is organizing this motorcycle gathering." Several veterans turned toward the sound, but Robert stepped forward. As the senior organizer, he felt responsible for handling any official business. He had dealt with law enforcement countless times during previous funeral escorts, and most officers were respectful and accommodating when they understood the purpose of the gathering. "That would be me, officer," Robert said, extending his hand. "Robert Martinez, Army retired. We're here to escort Staff Sergeant Chun to his final resting place." Officer Hayes glanced at the offer handshake, but did not reciprocate. Instead, he consulted his clipboard and began flipping through several pages of what appeared to be traffic regulations. The sight sent a chill through Robert, who had been expecting the usual cooperation that law enforcement typically provided for military funerals. "I'm going to need to see permits for this motorcycle procession," Officer Hayes announced loudly enough for the entire group to hear. "City ordinance requires advance notification and proper documentation for any organized parade or procession through municipal streets." A murmur of confusion rippled through the gathered veterans as Officer Hayes continued consulting his clipboard. Robert felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained his composure. In 30 years of military service, he had learned that staying calm in difficult situations usually led to better outcomes than losing one's temper. "Officer Hayes," Robert said, reading the name tag on a young man's uniform, "we coordinated this escort with your department last week. I spoke personally with Sergeant Thompson, and he assured me everything was in order." Officer Hayes looked up from his papers with an expression that suggested he had little interest in what Sergeant Thompson might have said. "Sergeant Thompson isn't here today, and I don't see any documentation in my files about this event. According to Municipal Code Section 12.3a, any procession of more than 5 vehicles requires a special event permit filed at least 14 days in advance." The morning air grew tense as more veterans gathered around the conversation. Frank Kowalski, a Vietnam veteran with 3 Purple Hearts, stepped forward with his hands clenched at his sides. His voice carried the rough edge of someone who had seen too much combat and too little respect for it afterward. "Son, we're burying a war hero today," Frank said, his Polish accent still evident after 50 years in America. "This isn't some parade or festival. This is a funeral escort for a soldier who died serving his country." Officer Hayes remained unmoved by the appeal. He flipped to another page on his clipboard and began reading directly from what appeared to be a regulation handbook. "The nature of the event doesn't exempt it from city ordinances. I'm also seeing potential violations regarding motorcycle safety equipment and formation riding regulations." Margaret Shin noticed the commotion from her position near the funeral home entrance and began walking toward the group. Robert saw her approaching and felt his heart sink. The last thing this grieving widow needed was additional stress on the day of her husband's burial. "Is there a problem?" Margaret asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the idle motorcycles. Robert turned to face her, struggling to find the right words. "Mrs. Chun, there seems to be some confusion about our permits. I'm sure we can sort this out quickly." Officer Hayes, however, showed no such consideration for the widow's presence. He continued reading from his clipboard as if Margaret were not standing 3 feet away. "I count 47 motorcycles here, which exceeds the limit for unpermitted gatherings. I'm also noting several violations of helmet laws and vehicle modification regulations." The young officer began walking among the motorcycles, examining each one with the thoroughness of someone conducting a formal inspection. He stopped at Tony Ree's 1985 Sportster and pulled out a citation book. Tony was a Gulf War veteran who worked as a mechanic and had customized his bike with extended handlebars and a modified exhaust system. "This motorcycle appears to be in violation of noise ordinances," Officer Hayes announced, writing rapidly on the citation pad. "The exhaust modification exceeds allowable decibel limits for operation within city limits." Tony's face flushed red as he watched the officer write. "That bike has passed state inspection every year for the past decade. I've never had any problems with it. State inspection doesn't supersede local noise ordinances," Officer Hayes replied without looking up from his writing. He tore off the citation and handed it to Tony. "You'll need to appear in municipal court on the date indicated to contest this violation." Margaret Shin watched the exchange with growing distress. Her daughters moved closer to her sides, sensing their mother's discomfort. The funeral director, Mr. Morrison, appeared at the funeral home entrance and checked his watch nervously. The procession was scheduled to depart in 20 minutes, and the hearse was already loaded and waiting. Robert realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. In all his years of organizing veteran events, he had never encountered such rigid enforcement of technicalities during a funeral service. Most law enforcement officers went out of their way to accommodate military honors, understanding the sacred nature of the ceremonies. "Officer Hayes," Robert said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had used when commanding troops, "I take full responsibility for any permit oversights. Write me the citation, and let these men escort their brother to his final rest." The young officer paused in his examination of another motorcycle and looked at Robert with what might have been surprise. For a moment, it seemed as though the human element of the situation might break through his rigid adherence to regulations. But the moment passed quickly. I appreciate your willingness to accept responsibility, Mr. Martinez, but violations are issued to individual operators based on specific infractions. I cannot transfer citations between parties. Officer Hayes moved to the next motorcycle in line and resumed his inspection. Frank Kowalski had heard enough. The 70-year-old veteran stepped directly into Officer Hayes' path and pointed a gnarled finger at the young man's badge. "You listen to me, rookie. We buried boys in rice paddies and desert sand so you could wear that uniform. Show some respect." The confrontation escalated quickly as Officer Hayes stepped back and placed his hand on his radio. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back and lower your voice. Interfering with a police officer in the performance of his duties is a misdemeanor offense." Robert quickly moved between Frank and the officer, placing a calming hand on the older veteran's shoulder. "Easy, Frank. Let's not make this worse than it already is." But the damage was spreading through the group like wildfire. Other veterans began voicing their frustrations, and Officer Hayes responded by calling for backup on his radio. The static from Officer Hayes' radio crackled through the morning air as he requested immediate backup for what he described as a potentially volatile gathering of uncooperative subjects. Robert winced at the terminology, knowing that these men and women had served their country with honor and deserved better than being labeled as troublemakers. Margaret Chin's composure finally cracked as she watched the situation deteriorate. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, and her teenage daughters wrapped their arms around her protectively. The sight of the grieving widow's distress sent a wave of anger through the assembled veterans that Robert knew would be difficult to contain. "Look what you've done," whispered Sandra Mitchell, a Navy veteran who had served 2 tours as a field medic. She approached Margaret and offered her a clean tissue. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry this is happening on your husband's funeral day." Officer Hayes seemed oblivious to the emotional impact of his actions. He continued his systematic inspection of the motorcycles, issuing citations for various equipment violations. His citation book was rapidly filling with tickets for modified exhausts, non-standard mirrors, and aftermarket lighting systems. Most of the modifications were cosmetic and had never caused safety issues during previous funeral escorts. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as backup units responded to Hayes' call. Robert felt a sense of dread as he realized the situation was escalating far beyond what anyone had anticipated. What should have been a simple escort to honor a fallen soldier was turning into a confrontation that would likely make headlines in the local newspaper. 3 additional patrol cars arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights flashing unnecessarily for what was essentially a permit dispute. The officers who emerged from these vehicles were older than Hayes and carried themselves with the confident bearing of experienced law enforcement professionals. Robert hoped their presence might bring some sanity to the situation. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stepped out of the lead patrol car and immediately assessed the scene. She had 23 years of experience with the Millbrook Police Department and had participated in dozens of funeral escorts during her career. Her eyes moved from the citation-wielding Officer Hayes to the distressed widow to the angry veterans, and Robert could see her piecing together what had happened. "Hayes, report," Sergeant Rodriguez called out as she approached the group. Officer Hayes straightened his posture and consulted his clipboard once again. "Sergeant, I've documented multiple violations of city ordinances regarding unpermitted processions and vehicle equipment standards. The organizer claims to have previous authorization, but I can find no documentation in our system." Sergeant Rodriguez took the clipboard from Hayes and quickly scanned the citations he had written. Robert watched her expression change from professional interest to barely concealed frustration. She looked at the grieving widow, then at the assembled veterans, and finally back at her subordinate officer. "Hayes, did you verify these supposed violations with the traffic division before issuing citations?" she asked in a tone that suggested she already knew the answer. "I followed standard protocol for enforcement actions during my assigned patrol duties," Hayes replied defensively. Sergeant Rodriguez turned away from Hayes and approached Robert directly. Her demeanor was respectful and professional, a marked contrast to the younger officer's rigid enforcement approach. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Rodriguez. I apologize for the confusion here today. Can you help me understand what you folks are trying to accomplish?" Robert felt a wave of relief at finally being addressed with basic human decency. "Sergeant, we're here to provide a motorcycle escort for Staff Sergeant William Chin's funeral procession. We coordinated with Sergeant Thompson last week, and he assured us we had proper clearance for the route to Riverside National Cemetery." Sergeant Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully and pulled out her own radio. "Dispatch, this is Rodriguez. Can you patch me through to Sergeant Thompson in Traffic Division?" While waiting for the connection, she turned to Margaret Chun and spoke in a gentle voice. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry for your loss and for this disruption on such a difficult day. We're going to get this sorted out immediately." Margaret managed a weak smile through her tears. "Thank you, Sergeant." Billy would have been so upset to see his friends treated this way. He always spoke highly of law enforcement when he was deployed overseas. The radio connection came through, and Sergeant Rodriguez stepped aside to speak with Sergeant Thompson. Robert could only hear fragments of the conversation, but the sergeant's body language suggested she was receiving confirmation of their previous authorization. Officer Hayes continued to hover nearby with his citation book, apparently unwilling to accept that his enforcement actions might have been premature. He approached one of the newer patrol officers and began explaining his interpretation of the various municipal codes he had been enforcing. Frank Kowalski had calmed down somewhat, but Robert could see the older veteran was still seething with anger. Frank had spent 13 months in Vietnam and had lost more friends than most people ever made. Being treated like a common criminal while trying to honor a fallen soldier was more than his pride could tolerate. "In my day, cops had respect for the military," Frank muttered to Robert. "That kid wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real combat zone, but he's got the nerve to hassle veterans at a funeral." Robert understood Frank's frustration, but he also recognized that most police officers were respectful and supportive of veterans. Officer Hayes appeared to be an unfortunate exception rather than the rule. Sergeant Rodriguez returned from her radio conversation with an expression that suggested the mystery had been solved. She walked directly to Officer Hayes and extended her hand for his citation book. "Hayes, there's been a miscommunication. Sergeant Thompson confirms that this funeral escort was properly authorized through our traffic division. All citations issued today need to be voided immediately." Officer Hayes' face flushed red as he reluctantly handed over his citation book. "Sergeant, I was following proper enforcement procedures based on the information available to me during my shift. The information available to you should have included checking with Traffic Division before taking enforcement action against what was clearly a funeral procession," Sergeant Rodriguez replied firmly. "This is exactly the kind of situation where discretion and common sense should override strict rule enforcement." The tension in the funeral home parking lot began to ease as Sergeant Rodriguez systematically voided each citation that Officer Hayes had issued. She moved from veteran to veteran, personally apologizing for the confusion and tearing up the tickets in front of their recipients. Her professional handling of the situation went a long way toward restoring some dignity to the proceedings. However, the damage to the morning's schedule had been significant. The funeral procession was now running 37 minutes behind schedule, and the cemetery staff would need to be notified of the delay. Mr. Morrison, the funeral director, approached Robert with obvious concern etched across his face. "Mr. Martinez, I've contacted the cemetery, and they're able to accommodate the delay, but we really need to get moving soon. The Chin family has relatives flying in from California who are expecting to arrive at the graveside service on time." Robert nodded and began gathering the veterans for a quick briefing about the modified timeline. Despite the earlier confrontation, the group's resolve had actually strengthened. If anything, Officer Hayes' heavy-handed approach had reinforced their determination to honor their fallen brother with the dignity he deserved. As the veterans prepared to mount their motorcycles, Sergeant Rodriguez approached Robert with a proposition that surprised him. "Mr. Martinez, if you're agreeable, I'd like to provide a full police escort for your procession today. It's the least we can do to make up for this morning's confusion." Robert appreciated the gesture, but he was also aware that adding a formal police escort might complicate the route they had planned. "Sergeant, we're grateful for the offer, but we've practiced this route several times, and our road guards know exactly where to position themselves for traffic control." "I understand your concern," Sergeant Rodriguez replied, "but I'm thinking more about protecting your group from any additional interference. Word of this morning's incident is probably already spreading through police radio channels, and I want to make sure no other officers misunderstand your mission." The wisdom of her suggestion became clear to Robert immediately. Having an official police escort would provide legitimacy and protection for the procession, ensuring that no other well-meaning but misinformed officers would attempt to interfere with the funeral honors. Margaret Chun approached the conversation and addressed Sergeant Rodriguez directly. "Sergeant, I want to thank you for resolving this situation so professionally. Billy always said that the best police officers were the ones who understood that their job was to serve the community, not just enforce rules." Sergeant Rodriguez smiled warmly at the compliment. "Your husband was absolutely right, ma'am. I'm honored to help ensure he receives the send-off he earned through his service." Meanwhile, Officer Hayes stood near his patrol car, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had been resolved. Several of the other officers had taken him aside for what appeared to be informal counseling sessions about judgment and discretion in law enforcement. Robert almost felt sorry for the young man, recognizing that his overzealous approach had probably stemmed from inexperience rather than malicious intent. Frank Kowalski, however, was less forgiving. As the veterans prepared to depart, he made a point of walking past Officer Hayes and speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Son, you might want to spend some time learning what real service looks like before you start hassling folks who've already proven theirs." Robert intervened before Frank could say anything more inflammatory. "Frank, let it go. We've got more important things to focus on today than teaching lessons to rookies." The sight of the flag-draped casket being loaded into the hearse served as a sobering reminder of why they were all there. Staff Sergeant William Chun had made the ultimate sacrifice for his country, and the focus needed to remain on honoring his memory rather than dwelling on the morning's unfortunate confrontation. As the motorcycles formed up in their predetermined order, Robert took his position at the front of the column. Behind him stretched a line of 46 other veterans, their machines gleaming in the late morning sun. The American flags mounted on their motorcycles fluttered in the gentle breeze, creating a powerful visual tribute to their fallen comrade. Sergeant Rodriguez coordinated with dispatch to clear the route and position traffic control officers at key intersections. Her professional handling of the logistics impressed Robert, who had seen military operations with less efficient coordination. It was clear that she understood both the importance of the mission and the proper way to honor fallen service members. The funeral procession finally departed the funeral home at 11:15, with Sergeant Rodriguez leading her patrol car followed by the hearse and the motorcycle escort. The route took them through the heart of Millbrook, past the elementary school where Billy Chun had once attended classes, past the park where he had played baseball as a teenager, and past the recruitment office where he had enlisted after high school graduation. Citizens along the route stopped what they were doing to pay their respects as the procession passed. Construction workers removed their hard hats and placed them over their hearts. Shopkeepers emerged from their businesses to stand silently on the sidewalks. At several intersections, spontaneous gatherings of people formed to salute or wave American flags as the motorcycles rumbled past. The sight of so much community support helped heal some of the wounds from the morning's confrontation. Robert felt his chest swell with pride as he witnessed the outpouring of respect for Billy Chen's sacrifice. This was what they had come to accomplish, and no amount of bureaucratic confusion could diminish the power of the community's tribute. Officer Hayes followed at the rear of the procession in his patrol car, presumably as part of the traffic control plan. Robert wondered what the young officer was thinking as he witnessed the genuine outpouring of respect and gratitude from the citizens of Millbrook. Perhaps this experience would help him understand that effective law enforcement sometimes required looking beyond the letter of the law to understand its spirit. The procession arrived at Riverside National Cemetery at 12:45, where an honor guard from the local American Legion post waited in crisp formation. The cemetery's rolling hills were dotted with white headstones that stretched toward the horizon, each marking the final resting place of someone who had served their country with honor. Billy Chun would join this silent army of heroes, taking his place among generations of American service members. As the motorcycles formed a respectful semicircle around the graveside, Robert felt the weight of the morning's events settling into perspective. What had begun as a confrontation over permits and regulations had evolved into something much more meaningful. The community's response to the funeral procession had demonstrated the enduring connection between civilians and the military members who served to protect their freedoms. Margaret Chin stood beside her husband's grave with quiet dignity as the honor guard performed their solemn duties. The folding of the American flag proceeded with practiced precision, each fold carrying symbolic meaning that connected Billy's service to the long history of American military sacrifice. When the ceremony concluded and the folded flag was presented to Margaret, there was not a dry eye among the assembled veterans. Sergeant Rodriguez approached Robert as the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse. "Mr. Martinez, I wanted to personally apologize again for this morning's confusion. Officer Hayes is a good young man, but he has some learning to do about when to enforce rules and when to show discretion." Robert shook the sergeant's hand warmly. "Sergeant, your professionalism today turned a potential disaster into something positive." Billy Chun would have appreciated seeing law enforcement and veterans working together to honor his memory. As they spoke, Officer Hayes appeared at the edge of their conversation. The young officer's earlier confidence had been replaced by an expression of uncertainty and what appeared to be genuine remorse. He stood silently for a moment before addressing Robert directly. "Mr. Martinez, I owe you and your group an apology. I was so focused on following regulations that I lost sight of what really mattered today. I've never been to a military funeral before, and I didn't understand the significance of what you were all trying to do." Robert studied the young man's face and recognized the sincerity in his words. Officer Hayes had made mistakes, but he seemed genuinely interested in learning from them. "Officer, we all make errors in judgment sometimes. The important thing is being willing to learn from them and do better next time." Frank Kowalski overheard the conversation and approached the group. The older veteran's earlier anger had cooled, replaced by the weary acceptance of someone who had seen enough conflict for one lifetime. "Son, being a good cop is a lot like being a good soldier. You need to understand the mission before you start following orders blindly." Officer Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "Sir, I'd like to learn more about what I should have done differently today. Would you be willing to help me understand the proper way to handle situations involving veteran activities?" The question surprised both Robert and Frank, but they recognized an opportunity to turn the day's negative experience into something constructive. Robert had spent much of his military career training young soldiers, and he understood the value of mentorship in developing good judgment. "Officer Hayes, our veterans group meets the first Tuesday of every month at the VFW Hall on Oakwood Street. If you're genuinely interested in learning about veteran issues and how law enforcement can better support our community, you're welcome to attend our next meeting." The invitation represented a significant gesture of reconciliation, and Officer Hayes accepted it immediately. "I'll be there, Mr. Martinez. Thank you for giving me the chance to make this right." As the cemetery began to empty, the veterans lingered near their motorcycles, reluctant to end their time together. These gatherings were more than just ceremonial obligations. They were opportunities to reconnect with people who understood the unique experiences and challenges of military service. The bonds forged in training and combat created friendships that lasted long after discharge papers were signed. Margaret Chun made her way through the group, personally thanking each veteran for their participation in Billy's funeral escort. Her grace and composure in the face of both grief and Morning's confusion impressed everyone she encountered. When she reached Robert, she grasped his hands firmly and looked directly into his eyes. "Mr. Martinez, Billy would have been so proud to see how his military family came together for him today. Even with all the complications this morning, you made sure he received the honor he deserved. I can never thank you enough for that." Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Ma'am, it was our privilege to serve alongside your husband, and it's our honor to ensure he's remembered properly. Billy was part of our brotherhood, and we take care of our own." As the veterans began their individual journeys home, Robert reflected on the lessons of the day. Officer Hayes' overzealous enforcement had initially threatened to derail an important ceremony, but the ultimate resolution had demonstrated the power of communication, understanding, and mutual respect. The young officer's willingness to learn and the veteran's willingness to teach suggested that future interactions between law enforcement and veteran groups might be more positive. The motorcycle escort tradition would continue, with new safeguards in place to prevent similar misunderstandings. Sergeant Rodriguez had promised to ensure that all patrol officers received briefings about recognizing and properly supporting veteran funeral activities. Officer Hayes had volunteered to help develop those training materials, bringing his fresh perspective to the process of improving police-veteran relations. Most importantly, Staff Sergeant William Chun had received the military honors he had earned through his service and sacrifice. The temporary confusion at the funeral home had not diminished the community's respect for his memory or the dignity of his final journey to Riverside National Cemetery. His widow could take comfort in knowing that her husband's military family had stood together to ensure he was remembered as a hero. As Robert started his Harley for the ride home, he thought about the phone calls he would need to make to ensure that future funeral escorts proceeded more smoothly. The veteran community was strong, but it required constant effort to maintain the traditions and connections that kept it together. Today's experience had reinforced his commitment to that ongoing mission, and he was already planning improvements for the next time they would gather to honor a fallen comrade.